don't know how powerful your voice is. They don't want to hear another legislator. They don't want to hear somebody else that's advocated. Sometimes they just want to hear that personal story.
The only way to stop asbestos-related cancers is to ban it.
About 40,000 Americans die every year of asbestos-caused diseases.
Jackie was trained at Mount Sinai. She actually directed the Educational Resource Center. She directed the World Trade Center Health Program at Sinai for many years, and that's especially notable this time of year, around September 11th. And then she moved to Northwell, where she founded the Department of Occupational Medicine Epidemiology, which she's been in charge of for a dozen or so years. And in addition, does on the side some research in asbestos-related disease. So welcome, Jackie.
Hi, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and we're going to talk a little bit about legacy and some other places you can find asbestos. So I'm going to skip through a lot of these, or I'm just going to let you read them because my colleagues have already covered it, but asbestos is found in a number of old buildings, but it's also found in a number of different materials, many of which are well known, like brakes and construction materials, but we'll talk about some that aren't as well known. So there's 6 basic types. You can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't feel it. People played with it. They threw snowballs because it didn't affect their skin. The only way to really tell is to test it. And you have to test it in a way that you can find it. You can't test it in a way that's below. There's something called a limit of detection. And if you set a limit of detection at a certain point that isn't sensitive enough to find it, you can say there's no asbestos, but what they're really not saying, what they're saying is they can't find it at that level of detection. They're not saying there's no asbestos there. They just don't have a method that's sensitive enough to find it. So we know that asbestos has been linked to talc in cosmetics and other uses of industrial talc. And in other products, it's been found in crayons, for example. So here's just some pictures. You can see why, as Chris said, it was amosite is brown asbestos because it looks brown. Chrysotolite was called blue asbestos because it appears more blue. And chrysotile is called white asbestos. And then the others are usually found, well, anthophyllite is found in Finland as a primary fiber there. And the others are often found in conjunction with some of the other commercial brands, which are the top 3. So legacy asbestos, we talked about it a little bit, and Andy talked about it in buildings with teachers. It refers to asbestos fibers that are embedded in buildings infrastructures around the U.S., actually around the world. The U.S. Senate in 2015 found that most states aren't systematically monitoring. You know, I was doing some work with the Health and Safety Committee of the United Federation of Teachers, a teachers union in New York. And in 1996, we were overwhelmed by Operation Clean House, which was what they called the asbestos, where they actually had to go and catalog according to HERA, which had already been passed. But we went into a number of schools where they cataloged where the asbestos was, and they did a huge remediation over the summer in 1996 for many of there are over 1,000 New York City schools. So as we talked about, it's in old buildings, and these exposures can cause serious illnesses when they're disturbed by fire, extreme weathers, and again, a lot of this was covered earlier. So there are legacy asbestos. We heard from the Duran family where Mr. Duran worked with cement pipes for a large part of his early career, and we know there's insulation on pipes and boilers that may still remain. I actually saw some patients a couple of weeks ago who were boiler makers, and they were exposed to asbestos when they were doing some boiler clean out and removal of an older boiler. So even in 2024, we're still seeing patients that are exposed to asbestos, and they realized they were exposed to asbestos. Luckily, the project supervisor had been trained, and he said, we're out of here, and he actually took a sample and had it tested. In attic and wall insulation, many buildings have vermiculite as poured in from that contains some of the Libby amphibole, siding and roofing materials, and children's toys. So there's here's some graphics on it. Toasters used to have asbestos. Some before the Consumer Product Safety expanded. It was used in some hair dryers, vinyl wallpaper. I mean, there's all sorts of places that when paint actually has industrial talc in it. And if you look at the, I think it's Nital is the brand, and one of the large paint companies used tons and tons of industrial talc in the formulation of their paints. And actually some of the textures on the outside paints actually were very heavy in the amount of industrial talc. And it's not something you think about also, because we think of paint as a liquid. And if you can't breathe in a liquid, but when you're making it, you can, and then there's opportunities for exposure. So you can see lots of duct adhesives. They're used in floor tile mastic, which is the stuff that makes the floor tiles sticky, and acoustical panels. These are too recent, so don't worry about this ceiling. And in a number of other places, asbestos mittens or gloves, they were used as the shields and Bunsen burners. So consumer products, there have been a number of products. I talked about a few of them, and they were in the early 1900s to 1980s. And this really exposed folks from all walks of life. And we're thinking consumer products as things that you would encounter as a consumer, not just as someone in the construction field. For example, there are people who were remodeling their houses, and so they wanted to make the ceilings look pretty. So they would do swirls of joint compound. So they'd mix up the dry joint compound with some water, and then they would make their little swirls, except that the joint compound had a lot of asbestos in it. So they didn't realize that by decorating their house themselves, they were exposing themselves. So other children's toys like modeling clay and crayons. We know that modeling clay, again, has the industrial talc in it, and so does ceramics. So people who made, it's called the slip or the green in making pottery. And then often when it comes out of the mold, it's actually shaved so that there's an opportunity for exposure even after it's been mixed. And other objects, the infamous Kent micronite filters from 1952 to 1956 had chrysotolite, oven mitts, bottle warmers, sports and other recreational equipment. So rubber, I remember there was a study that was looking actually at brake linings and brake workers in Connecticut, and they found that there were a host of people who were in the rubber industry who had mesothelioma. And I said, why would people working with rubber, which is a different product that has its own host of issues, have mesothelioma? And it turns out that when you're making tires, to make them not stick, they're dusted in talc. So they all had this talc exposure when they were working, and that was the exposure. And it's also used as a component in the molds to help get the rubber out. So there's bags and bags, tons of it used in the rubber industry. And then we found it's in cosmetic talc, and it's been in talcum powder, face and body powders. So talc is a mineral crushed into a powder, absorbs moisture, oil, odor, and is a lubricant, why it was used in tires. It's used in a number of cosmetics, some of which it's bound, and some of it is loose. It's also used in food processing. It's actually put into pills and things like that. Chewing gum, insecticides, polished rice. I don't know if it's still being used for this, but historically it was. So talc and asbestos are minerals found close together. They grow geologically and in a similar habitat or a habit. And but often the talc, because it's sort of a transition from talc to fibrous talc to asbestos, it's a continuum. And so the asbestos goes with the talc. So one geologist has said, I don't like the term asbestos contaminated talc. He said, because it's not contaminating it, it just is. So it's asbestos and talc together. So it's not so much as contaminant, because that seems like it's been added. It's just the natural product. So we see talc, it absorbs moisture, reduces skin, found in powder compacts, finishing powder, eyeshadows, blushes, foundations, and creams. The creams you don't worry about so much because it gets bound up. But when it's in loose powders, or even you can see that palette there is pressed powder. So that's, people will do weird things where they'll scrape it with their nail when it's in a pressed powder so that it more readily flows. People do interesting things with makeup. So the 2019, the FDA, which does not regulate talc, but found asbestos in nearly 20% of 52 cosmetic samples. Products included the ones listed there, and a study in 2020 revealed 14% of cosmetic products contained talc, also showed asbestos traces. So if you use sensitive enough techniques, you will find it. There are techniques that were published in the 90s that show that you can concentrate whatever fibers are there and find the amphiboles. It doesn't show the chrysotile that's there because of the different weighting in these very specialized techniques, but there are other ways of looking at that. But the bottom line is it became much more in the public's eye that people were aware that cosmetic talc could potentially cause asbestos related diseases, including mesothelioma. So this is just Claire's products. They found this was actually one of the first times that it really made the press. Although in the 1970s, there were a lot of articles about cosmetics found in talc, asbestos found in talc actually from Mount Sinai in the 1970s. So here's just some test results that came from Claire's where they found asbestos in it. And it was really disconcerting because these were marketed to preteens. So here you can just see where they found it and the type of asbestos, I think, is on there. Or the percentage. And again, here's some other products that showed that asbestos was present. Again, additional, and this led to a recall of one of the products in 2019. The most popular brand of baby powder was recalled from this batch after it was found to be tested. So the future considerations, we're going to be exploring this a lot more later about EPS, banned chrysotile, and 6 conditions. I think Andrea alluded to it in terms of taking the history. And one of the things that I've been talking about and why I think Andy was talking about the differential, or maybe Chris was talking about the differential between men and women. How many of you have ever had a really good occupational history taken when you went to the doctor? They ask, what did you do? Just raise your hand if you've ever, how many of you have been asked what you did when you went to the doctor? That one I expect everyone to be. Someone will say, what do you do? How many of you have actually asked what you did, not what your job title was? Okay. Now, how many of you have ever been asked what kind of consumer products you use in your home? So none of you have. So when we look at these studies that talk about it, and some of the studies on women are god awful. If they didn't fit the criteria that they were asking the men of the 9 most common professions where asbestos was used, if the women weren't a part of that profession, then they had no exposure. They didn't ask if there were family members of those who did that even, but it was just, but no one ever asks about certain exposures. So if you don't ask, you're never going to know. Doctors don't realize that there are things like asbestos containing consumer products, whether it be paint or whether it be talcum powder. So no one's ever going to really know what the source of it was. I think over time we've had the ability from some of our colleagues in the legal field who have probed those questions when they've gotten people who have not fit a traditional asbestos worker mold, where we've learned much more about it and we've been able to define some of the exposures that may be pertinent and get the word out so that people will know to how to protect their health in the future. And that would become the primary prevention so that we have to do a lot less CT scans for that tertiary prevention. Thank you.